Okay, so we're also talking about issues of racism and exploitation against Southeast Asian workers. So don't worry if there are some words here that you're not familiar with because I'm going to cover what they mean in a minute, okay? Okay, so first, what does migrant mean? What is a migrant? A migrant is a person who moves from their home country to a new country for work. So move from their home country to a new country just for work. So usually migrant is a temporary word. It's a person who's only there to work and eventually returns home. So this is slightly different than an immigrant. Immigrant, an immigrant is someone who permanently stays in a new country. So they want to stay there forever, and becomes a citizen or a permanent resident of the new country. That is the difference between migrant and immigrant. So technically, a migrant is just anyone who go to a new country. So even if you're a Taiwanese and you go to America to have a better job, then you can still be considered a migrant worker. Or if you are Taiwanese and you go to Australia or something like that, you're just a migrant. You're still a migrant, I mean. Versus an immigrant is when you want to move there permanently, forever. So there are two different words that are very similar in meaning. Um, Migrant workers in Taiwan mostly come from four countries around Asia, Southeast Asia. So south and east. South and east. There are all these countries that are close to Taiwan. So, for example, the Philippines is very close to Taiwan and is a large population of migrant worker come from the Philippines. Another is Indonesia. Indonesia down here is a collection of islands. So the red part, because Indonesia and Malaysia share some territory here, like this island called Borneo, they share it. So Indonesia is another big one, and Thailand and Vietnam. These are the major numbers of migrant workers. There are migrant workers from other countries, also in Asia, but the vast majority, or most of them, come from these countries. For example, Indonesia has 258,703 migrant workers that are currently living and working in Taiwan. So that's a huge population. And there are only 61,000 from Thailand. So that means that the rest of the workers must be only in the few thousands, even in Malaysia. So that's where the migrant workers come from. Here are some examples of some jobs that migrant workers will be doing. Okay, so first we got to stop and think about what some new vocabulary mean, okay? The first vocabulary is crisis. A crisis is a problem that is very, very serious and probably unsolved. Here is an example. In 2008, the American banks gave out more loans than people were able to pay back, and this caused a global economic crisis. A crisis here was that there was no money for the bank, so the banks were about to collapse, and that means that nobody had anywhere to put their money, and also the money that they already expect to be in the banks would be gone. And so many people would suffer. So this was a crisis. What do we do? Well, we learned what they did is the American government gave them everybody's taxpayer dollars to try to save the bank. And then the banks gave themselves big bonus. But that's also another crisis. So sometimes crisis leads to other crisis. But the word crisis means it's a horrible situation. Next word, exploitation. 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 An exploitation is when you're using other people as tools or objects only to benefit or help yourself. That is called exploitation. So, an example would be the exploitation of indigenous people in Taiwan as cheap labor left many of those people still poor today. This means that back in the day, indigenous people's labor was much cheaper and also their land much cheaper. So foreign power from Dutch, from China, from Japan, they all took advantage of indigenous people or exploited them. They used them as tools to only benefit themselves and they didn't care how many indigenous people were hurt in the process. That is exploitation. Last one is migrant. We talked about it already. Migrant is a person who moves moves to a new country just for work. So Taiwanese migrant workers mostly work in the factories, building things, on ships, and taking care of old people. So that is Taiwanese migrant. Okay, so even though we established migrant worker is just anyone who moved to another country for work, in Taiwan, migrant worker is a special word for the government, and it's a special classification or category of worker. And that's why those workers mostly come from poor country and South Asia. Okay, because they're only allowed to do those jobs that Taiwanese don't want to do. But those jobs, even though Taiwanese don't want to do them, are critical. Taiwan actually survives on these jobs. The first one is social welfare migrant worker. This category is for the aging population of Taiwan. There are a lot of old people who live in Taiwan. And because there are so many old people, they need people to take care of them. They have retired. They're too old to be able to take care of themselves properly. So many Taiwanese don't want to, or they have to do work. They have to go do their own jobs. They don't have time to stay home and take care of their own aging parents. And other Taiwanese don't want to come and work as this kind of servant either. But these old people, they really need special service or they might die. Okay, so examples of workers that are in this category are family helper. This is more like a servant. They cook the meal. They clean the house. Patient care. The domestic patient care, these are the ones, they have to live inside someone's house just to take care of the old people. Wash them because they're too old and they might fall in the shower and hurt themselves. Or help them with their adult diaper or something like this. And the last one is institutional care. This is for the old people or the dying or the people who have mental disorder and they need extra help and they can't live in a normal house anymore. So they have to go to a building like a hospital and live in the hospital for a long time. Those hospitals cannot find enough nurses in Taiwan who want to help this kind of job. So instead, they must recruit them from other countries, like Philippines. And the last category is called industrial migrant worker. Industrial, it just means anything that have to do with industry, so making things, usually in factory work, but can also be fishing. So most of these migrant workers work in construction. So most of the buildings you see in Taiwan, they're not built by Taiwanese people, but built by migrant workers doing the hard physical labor. The Taiwanese person is usually the foreman, decide how the building is built, or the architect, come up with the plan. But the people on the ground building the thing oftentimes will be a migrant worker. And the last one is, and also manufacturing. So in the factories, the people making the chips, that Taiwan's biggest industry, I'm not sure if you know this, is computer chips. It's the one that Taiwan makes the most money, and they produce the vast majority of the world's chips. But the people working in the factory making the chips, doing the hard labor part, is not Taiwanese. It's often migrant worker from other country around Asia, also paid less. And also it can be other, it doesn't have to be computer chips. Any factory in Taiwan can employ migrant workers to help work these factory jobs. And the last one is just fishing. That's the offshore fishing that I had told you about earlier. This is when, so Taiwan's other big industry for agriculture is fishing. And they sell a lot of fish around Asia. And they often will hire a migrant worker to work on their ship. And as long as they don't come into Taiwanese water, then they can skirt the law and pay them very tiny wages. And even beat them, and nobody knows what's happening on the ship because they take and they confiscate the phone for the period of the contract. So the workers can't contact for help oftentimes, or then they only find out when somebody has died from abuse or working too much. So migrant workers are a special classification of worker in Taiwan. Although technically speaking, any person who comes to work in a new country is a migrant worker, only those workers coming to work in two industries are considered migrant workers in Taiwan. These migrant workers fill the most difficult jobs in Taiwanese society, specifically building things like houses, fishing, and also taking care of elderly people.